Following Russia's spring offensive with Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, in the crosshairs, NATO partners gave Kyiv the green light to use the weapons they provided inside Russian territory up to a point. That has helped stall Moscow's offensive, which some analysts see as a turning point.
The aftermath of Russian shelling in the Kharkiv region in early May. Initial gains by Russian forces seemed to catch Ukraine off guard and raised fears that Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, could be in danger, potentially paving the way for another attempt to seize Kyiv. It's thought that Moscow's strategy may have been to force Ukraine to move its forces from the embattled town of Chasiv Yar on the eastern front to the Kharkiv region in the north, to enable a breakthrough in the Donetsk region. President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed Kharkiv would not be allowed to fall and appealed to Kyiv's Western allies to drop some of their limits on the use of missiles on Russian territory. In response, Ukraine's Western backers, including the United States and Germany, lifted some of their weapons restrictions, previously seen as a red line. The U.S. said Kyiv could now fire American-made long-range missiles, known as ATACMS, across the border into Russian territory, where many troops are stationed directly on the other side. Some analysts say it's been one of the bloodiest campaigns in Russia's war on Ukraine, with up to hundreds of poorly trained Russian soldiers being killed every day. But while Ukraine and its allies focused on preventing Kharkiv from falling, Russian forces did make advances in the east, forcing the withdrawal of some Ukrainian troops from Chasiv Yar. Still, Kyiv has demonstrated it can adapt quickly, maintaining its defenses and preventing Russia from making deeper territorial gains.
For more on this, we can talk to Gustav Gressel now. He's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and is currently here in Berlin. Welcome to the program. Gustav, first of all, give us your assessment of how Ukraine and Russia are currently positioned on the battlefield. Does Ukraine have what it needs to defend itself and push Russia back?
Well, the Russian summer offensive or the major offensive for this year is still going on. I would not yet call Ukraine being on the other side of the hill. I guess they will have some 2-3 months still where they have to train their new recruits, and personnel is quite stretched. But Ukraine has battered the Russian offensive quite well so far. Some minor mishaps, but they were minor. And yeah, by autumn, of course, the tide could stall, I would say. But the thing is, of course, Western assistance is good for the end of the year or into the spring. But then we have the U.S. presidential and legislative elections, and we'll have to see where international assistance goes from there. And that's a bit of the unknown. But for now, yes, given the circumstances, things look better.
Now, at that NATO summit in Washington that just wrapped up, Ukraine was told that its path to NATO membership was, quote, irreversible. But Kyiv was not given a timeline for joining NATO. Without such a timeline commitment, can we really say that Kyiv's NATO membership prospects have improved?
Not really, because the principle of the open door has been there since ever, basically. And if we remember back, the infamous Bucharest summit declaration that Georgia and Ukraine would join NATO, but just not now and at a not defined point in the future, is pretty much the same. Well, on the other hand, a political invitation with a clause that if conditions are met would be, of course, a stronger signal. But, of course, in practice, Ukraine knows that as long as the war is ongoing in the current phase, NATO membership is pretty difficult to achieve, even thereafter. But the signal, of course, to the Ukrainian population, that is the important thing these days. Ukraine fights for its independence and fights for its sovereignty. Ukraine had tried to choose a different path than a Russian satellite for decades, and they see NATO membership as kind of the long-term proof seal and security guarantee that they will not be ever again a Russian satellite. And that's why sort of the reason people die for. They don't die for any particular president or for a political party. They die for their kids growing up in a country that has chosen the path of independence. And hence, I think the stronger the signal these days, the better.
Now, NATO members at that summit have pledged to step up delivery of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. How important are those jets for Ukraine?
They're very, very important. The air war is basically one of the underreported sides of this whole war. We have seen a devastating missile attack a few days ago. These cruise missiles can be intercepted by fighter patrols if Ukraine has enough fighters in the air to cope with them. Unfortunately, because their current Soviet-era fighters are very much worn out and they lack missiles for these fighters, they don't have sufficient fighter patrols in the air to cope with their defensive counter-air duties. The other thing is, of course, then to keep Russian fighter bombers away from Ukrainian airspace. That's an important task. And for all these tasks, it's roughly estimated that Ukraine needs about 80 operable fighters. And we are unfortunately very much below that benchmark.
Now, Ukraine has been given permission to use some of its Western weapons to strike Russian targets within a limited range of the border inside of Russia. Talk to us about that limitation. How significant is it?
Well, for Ukraine, the lifting of the previous limitation not to strike Russia at all was tremendously important because Russia has been a sanctuary. Now, of course, they have a 100-kilometer range limit. And, of course, all the targets they strike inside Russia with Western weapons, they are pre-arranged with a U.S. and soon NATO command in Germany that agrees on the targets to be struck. Now, the kind of individual target coordination thing, that works pretty well, and I think this limitation is not a problem. The range limitation for Ukraine is a problem, especially when we look at air bases. A lot of the glide bombs attack Russia conducts are flown from air bases inside Russia, relatively close to Ukraine, from Rostov-on-Don, Voronezh, Belgorod, this area. And here, of course, Ukraine would love to strike these air bases to move the Russian fighters further away, because the further away Russian fighters are stationed, the more time they have to spend flying in and out the theater and can't fly so many sorties a day. And that would, of course, ease the pressure on Ukrainian front lines, but also on cities close to the border that are bombarded by glide bombs pretty much on a daily basis.
Do you think that 100-kilometer limitation will be broadened, that Ukraine might eventually be given permission to strike deeper into Russia?
I think it will. I have to say that all these kind of general limitations make no military sense. You have to look at what's going on, what Russia is preparing, how much a given target plays a role in Ukraine's defenses, and then have to weigh the risk of allowing Ukraine to strike it versus the risk of allowing the target to be there and do its stuff. And whether you do that, whether you weight the risk on a target that is 30 kilometers away or 250 kilometers away, it doesn't really matter. And I think the target coordination that has been put in place with the Ukrainians since the beginning of the delivery of rocket artillery systems has worked for over 2 years. And Ukrainians have honored their previous commitments. They know that if they don't get any supplies of these missile systems anymore. So, of course, they have a reason to honor that. And I think this kind of case-by-case judgment is the best way to go. All these kind of general assumptions basically just give the Russians an idea where to base their ammunition and missile systems to be outside the strike range and do whatever they do and want to do, and and sort of force us into a debate on perceived Russian red lines that we have to cross again and again and again and again.
Gustav, thank you very much for talking with us today. That was Gustav Gressel, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you very much.
A joint statement by NATO's 32 members says that Ukraine is on a, quote, irreversible path to membership. At the alliance's 75th anniversary summit, they also pledged 40 billion euros of aid to Kyiv next year, but most of that aid is set to come from the bloc's largest member, the U.S. And with NATO skeptic Donald Trump challenging President Biden in November's election, there's no assurance of long-term funding.
With the specter of a Donald Trump presidency looming large over Washington, NATO leaders moved to future-proof the military alliance. Top of their list, Ukraine, which Trump has threatened to cut support for if re-elected.
We will increase our support for Ukraine by establishing a NATO coordination and the security assistance and training for Ukraine, and by ensuring a sustained support for the long term.
The plan includes minimum funding of 40 billion euros in military aid within the next year. It also includes a new command center in Germany to coordinate training and weapons deliveries. But there's also short-term relief on the horizon.
And I'm also pleased to announce that as we speak, the transfer of F-16 jets is underway, coming from Denmark, coming from the Netherlands. And those jets will be flying in the skies of Ukraine this summer to make sure that Ukraine can continue to effectively defend itself against the Russian aggression.
Good evening, everyone.
However, members stopped short of extending a clear invite to join the alliance.
As Ukraine continues its vital reforms, we will continue to support them on their irreversible path to NATO membership. The work we are doing together now will ensure that when the time is right, Ukraine can join without delay. It is not a question of if, but when.
Members sought to send a message of power and resolve to both friends and foes, as NATO grapples with the likelihood of losing its most senior leader.
Let's get some analysis now from Ian Lesser. He's a distinguished fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and his areas of expertise include U.S. foreign policy and NATO. Thanks for being with us. Dr. Lesser, NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg says Ukraine's path to membership in the alliance is irreversible. What does that really mean?
Well, it's essentially a strong repetition of what the alliance has said for the last years to Kyiv. There's not a time frame, and that may disappoint some, but irreversible is a pretty strong word to use. Of course, there are conditions that are associated with this that have to do with reform in Ukraine, but also, I think, for many allies, simply the end of the war, or at least a ceasefire, because it would be very difficult to envision membership for Ukraine and all the commitments that go along with that under conditions of war, and that's what we have at the moment.
Now, NATO has announced the establishment of a new command center for Ukraine here in Germany. How will that enhance operational capabilities, do you think?
Well, over the last years, most of the coordination of aid that's been sent to Ukraine has been done by the United States through the Ramstein process, also in Germany. And there's a desire to shift more of this to NATO. I mean, partly, I think, to satisfy the American debate about burden sharing, but also, in a sense, to make this a more collective exercise and to put the framework in place for Europe to do more. Part of that's unease about whether the American commitment will be as steady in the future, but part of it is simply about being more efficient. And I think that's what the alliance has in mind with this new command center.
You mentioned a commitment in the future. Many are concerned that Donald Trump may return to the U.S. presidency. How might a potential Trump presidency affect NATO support for Ukraine?
Well, of course, former President Trump as a candidate has said quite a bit about this. He is very keen to see more allied commitment to Europe's own defense, and he's, in a sense, skeptical about the current approach to Ukraine. Whether anything changes in that regard is not entirely clear if he were to be elected. But even if he isn't elected, whatever the outcome, there is going to be an intensifying debate about how to support Ukraine, in what way, who should be doing it, and what to expect. And I think in the near term, what we have, regardless of politics on both sides of the alliance, and of course there are critics in Europe too, as we know, within the alliance, in Hungary not least, but also some elsewhere, that the alliance concentrates on strengthening Ukraine's defense and, in a sense, deferring this question of NATO membership for Ukraine.
Talk to us, Dr. Lessing, about China in relation to NATO. It's increasingly a focus of attention for the alliance. At the summit, the alliance accused Beijing of being what it calls a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine and demanded that China halt the delivery of weapons components. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it reflects a generalized anxiety on both sides of the Atlantic about the role that China is playing. And China has repeatedly said that it's not delivering offensive weapons to Russia. That may or may not be true. Others, like Iran and North Korea, definitely are. But clearly, China has become a leading conduit and also source for the high tech and other materials that would be needed for Russia to support its war effort. And there's a lot of focus on that. I think, the fact that China figures prominently in the communique that was issued from the summit yesterday reflects this. The last summit in Vilnius started to talk more seriously about China as a systemic challenge to NATO allies. This summit clearly goes much further.
Well, while NATO leaders were meeting there in Washington, China was holding joint military exercises with Belarus just across the border from NATO member Poland. Is that timing, do you think, a coincidence?
I suspect it isn't a coincidence. But I think the real focus is not so much China acting somehow in Europe or in Ukraine's neighborhood. It's more about this more distant but very important supply of technology and know-how and other things to Russia at the moment, but also for the next years. And behind that too, I think there is, a rather sharp debate about what the rise of China means for European and American security. And that's become a tougher debate on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, just to say, there aren't too many things that Democrats and Republicans agree on in Washington these days. A tougher line on China is clearly one of them.
Dr. Lesser, thank you very much for talking with us today. That was Ian Lesser, Distinguished Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, talking to us from Brussels.
Good to be with you.